This year, it's 6.8. Now, this is much higher than what we have typically aimed at. So, on the face of it, you cannot say that the fiscal deficit is constraining you because it's actually pitched at a relatively high level. The real problem is that the fiscal deficit has been projected on the assumption of an 11.3% growth of GDP, which is what presumably the finance minister thought was reasonable when she presented the budget way back in early February. Now, what has happened since then is that we've had a second wave of the corona pandemic, led to some lockdowns, a lot of further interruptions. I don't think most people don't expect that you're going to get an 11.3% growth. I mean, even the RBI has lowered the growth rate to about 9.5, and many other people say that, it will be actually much lower than that. So, when people, very distinguished leaders of industry have said, we need a bigger fiscal deficit, more stimulus, you have to ask yourself, are they saying that, look, you're currently aiming at 11.3, and that's not good enough. We want even more growth, therefore we want stimulus. Or are they actually saying that, look, I don't think you're going to get 11.3. Your growth rate is going to be much less. Therefore, you need to do something on the stimulus front, because if you stick with the 6.8% fiscal deficit, when your GDP is much lower, you'll be forced to cut expenditure, and we don't want to do that. I think that's what they're saying, and I think they're right. I mean, in the present circumstances, I think the correct approach for us should be that whatever happens to the revenues, the government should make it clear that they're not going to spend less, which means that if the fiscal deficit is going to go up, it should be allowed to go up. Okay? Think of it this way. Why should the fiscal deficit not be allowed to rise? One important reason for that is that when the government borrows a lot, it squeezes the private sector out of the market. And resources that might otherwise have gone to corporate bonds don't go there because the government, which is a sovereign, is picking up all the resources. And if the economy was in a position where the private sector wanted to invest and was being crowded out, that would be very unfortunate. But the present situation is one in which, for whatever reason, the private sector is not in a position to invest. So I think that private investment is not being crowded out. If income is going to be much lower, then demand is going to be much lower. And what is worse is that the uncertainty which the pandemic has created is affecting not only businessmen, but households. I mean, look, some households have simply lost employment and income directly. Others who are in the formal sector have not yet lost their income and employment, but they're not sure about what's going to happen. I mean, if nothing else, they're not sure whether they'll have to incur big expenditures if they fall ill or if somebody in the family falls ill. So in that environment, private consumption will not boom. People will postpone until they feel a little more sure. So as a result, we're in an environment where we will find a lack of demand in the system, and the government, in my view, should make sure that that does not compromise whatever growth we are capable of. So in that sense, I think the fiscal deficit, getting stuck on the 6.8% of the fiscal deficit would not, in my view, be the right thing to do. Now, whether that's stopping reforms, I wouldn't say so. I mean, for example, one of the interesting things that government, in my view, should do is to be aggressive in privatizing public sector assets. Now, this is something the government has said they're going to do, which is good. But what actually happens in a depressed situation is that they won't get the kind of prices they were expecting to get for these assets. So will they sell anyway and at least get the privatization done and raise some resources? Or will somebody will say, no, this is not fair, we're not getting a good return, let us not sell. Let us not sell means either the fiscal deficit will be much worse, or somebody will say, let us not sell and let us cut expenditure. I think that would be the wrong thing to do. Some of these other reforms like farm laws, etc., They are not prevented by the fiscal deficit. I mean, they have been prevented because I think it's not been well managed politically. And let's face it, all reforms create uncertainties. One of the big problems with any reform is that uh, it's only business management types who believe that reforms are a win-win situation where everybody sees what the benefits are. The truth is that in the short run, many reforms will hurt the people who are currently engaged in something, but they will produce lots of positive effects over time. The difficulty is that those who are hurt can see that they're going to be hurt immediately. But those who will get better jobs later, well, they're not sure who will get them. They won't be certain until the reforms play out. So it's very important to consult widely and sort of let everybody feel that they've had a sense of survival. I think because that was not done in the case of the farm laws, you have this tremendous agitation. And my personal view is that the liberalization in the farm laws, which the government attempted, is actually the right thing to do. As a matter of fact, during the UPA, we were making these recommendations. But at that time, our interpretation was that these can only be done by state governments. So actually, we were simply telling the state governments that, look, why don't you do it? And of course, we never really persuaded any state government, and that reflected the political resistance to these changes. What the present government has done is that they've interpreted the constitution to say that no, it doesn't have to be done by state governments, it can be done also by the center. Now, I'm not a constitutional expert, so I don't know whether that's correct or not correct. But I think they were also passed in a very hasty way, in the sense that when one of the members of the opposition asked for an actual vote, that was not allowed, and it was passed on a voice vote. This creates a basis for political opposition, and that's what happened. Once something gets politicized, I mean, you have to handle it politically. I'm sure the government is discussing these things with farm unions. Let's see what happens. But I don't think that farm laws are being prevented by the fiscal deficit. They're two completely different things.
Yes, so thank you, sir, for your answer and your nuanced personal views on the farm laws. So dwelling a bit more on the fiscal front. So we all know that monetary and fiscal policy, these are broadly the two arms of tackling or managing the economy. So, sir, given that inflation has risen considerably of late, both retail and wholesale inflation, so do you think that the country has more room on the fiscal front as compared to the monetary front to revive the economy at present?
Yeah, one preface, fiscal and monetary are the two main instruments for what I would call short-term management of the economy. Longer-term things are all these structural reforms that you have to bring about. Okay. Now, coming to the short term, I think the monetary area, the Reserve Bank has done what many other central banks have done. They've recognized that the economy is badly hit. They've recognized that demand is being hurt, and they've recognized that in that environment we must make credit easy, and that's what they've done. That, I think, was the right thing to do. But making credit easy doesn't solve the problem, because if you have a problem of insolvency, then simply giving more credit isn't going to help, because at the end of the process, this credit has to be repaid. And many of the enterprises that are getting, first of all, the well-run enterprises, if they sense that they cannot actually make money out of the investments, they're not going to ask for more credit. They will consolidate on strengthening their own balance sheet, put themselves in a better position. And that is what has happened in the formal sector. But, although sales revenue has not done well, profits have done very well. Now, what they've done is they've just got rid of a lot of the informal labor force they have. And, you can understand that, because if these guys had taken on a certain amount of labor on the assumption that the economy was going to grow at 8%, and they come to a situation where it's growing at -7%. Maybe for the first 4 or 5 months, they believe there'll be a quick revival. Now they see that there isn't a quick revival. Maybe it'll be stuck for 5% growth for a couple of years. They just get rid of excess labor. I mean, they can always bring it back if the recovery takes place. But in that environment, making credit available doesn't do anything on the demand side. Fiscal measures do, because fiscal measures actually add demand. Like I would say that, at a time when the private sector is not able to invest, if the government had anticipated this problem and said, look, we need to have a plan B where next year we will have to have a much larger expansion in investment expenditure and got a series of public sector programs ready, road building, railway expansion, that kind of stuff, they would have been able to spend money in these areas. And these are long-term requirements. India is short of infrastructure. So if you build an infrastructure today, even if it's not used today, I mean, it's something that will be useful over the next 20 years or so. So I think that's a fiscal measure. And I think we have not done enough of that. If you look at any analysis of the Indian response to the crisis, the pure fiscal component of the response is actually small. Is a large monetary response, but that doesn't actually do very much. Most other countries have had a more dramatic fiscal response. We have not. And I think that there are two kinds of fiscal responses that are justified. One, when you have a lot of very poor people who've lost their incomes, it becomes, and we don't have a social safety net. We don't have social security. It's a kind of basic moral obligation of society that people who are able to work and willing to work and suddenly lost their work, we should be able to do something for them. And that's why I think schemes like Manrega and so on, which provide an opportunity in rural areas for people to get sort of subsistence income, should actually be strengthened. And we should make it clear that we're willing to provide more money. Similarly, vaccines. We should be willing to spend on vaccines because it is the thing that will most increase confidence that the economy is getting back to normal. I mean, we're talking about, your presentation had this thing about, gymnasiums and restaurants and hotels and malls and transportation and so on, which aren't doing well. But, the only way that these will recover is if people start moving about, and people will start moving about if they're vaccinated. So we should definitely do that. But in order to do that, we have to be realistic about what the current position is, and do we need to do it, or is the economy actually booming? So I think, the first thing in my view the government should do is to come clean that we're not going to get 11.3%. Now, if you're going to get 10.5 and not 11.3, maybe that's not so bad. But if you're going to get 7, then maybe that isn't good enough. So I think that's what we need to address. 1 second. Hello? Hello? I'm on a Zoom call. Yeah. So that's the I think the fiscal, between monetary and fiscal, we've done all the monetary, and I don't think it's going to have much effect. The inflation is now going up. RBI will be watched very, very carefully, whether it simply keeps expanding money or whether it observes the mandate it had, which is to keep in mind inflation. So most probably, in fact, to retain its own credibility, it should actually signal, it has signaled that it's going to be more cautious. Therefore, if we need to stimulate the economy, it can only be done on the fiscal side. Now, there are other, I would say one of the most critical reforms we need to do for the next 2 or 3 years is to fix the banking system. Your presentation drew attention to the fact that the banks are in deep trouble. I think there are many items on the reform agenda which, if the government wanted to give a very clear signal that it is reforming, it should do that. Secondly, on the fiscal side, I think we have to recognize that tax revenues have not done as well as was hoped. I mean, the GST is an excellent reform. In the UPA, we were pushing for it. At that time, the BJP opposed it, but it's good that when they came to power, they implemented it. Politics is one thing, but I have no difficulty where you take a political position when you're in opposition and quickly get it done when you're in power. That's fine. But I think that what has happened is in the discussions between the center and the state, that GST Council has not worked the way it should have to produce a rational GST rate structure. Too many things are left out. The zero rate items are far too large. And I think that one of the critical things is that the rate structure, too many things have too high a rate which could be lowered, and too many things have too low a rate which could be raised. I think they need to do that, and they need to fix that because, everybody in every other environment where the GST has been introduced, it has led to an increase in revenue as a ratio of GDP, but it hasn't done that so far. Now, there's a lot of excitement about the last month. When you're getting out of a pandemic and a huge negative decline, negative movement, 1 month improvement is okay, but I think that's a major area where we need to focus on to reform the system. And there are many others that we also need to do.
Thank you once again, sir, for that insightful answer. It is really great to listen from someone who has been shaping our fiscal policy for so long. Sir, another question which we have is, will the India's reluctance in joining RCEP and rolling out of the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative take a toll on India's competitiveness?
Well, that's a very good question. So let me make 2 points. First of all, the Atmanirbhar initiative, it's an excellent slogan because it gives a sense that we want the economy to be strong and so on. Everybody has to agree with that. But it's not very clear what Atmanirbhar actually implies, and it's now being used for everything. For example, the revival of the economy is also called Atmanirbhar. Protection is called Atmanirbhar. Not joining RCEP is called Atmanirbhar. So frankly, there's a lot of confusion on what Atmanirbhar really means. So let me come specifically to the issue of whether this is a reversal towards protectionism. It is true that this government has raised the rate of import duties in the last 3 or 4 years consistently. This is a reversal of a fairly long trend across many different governments, including the Vajpayee government, that we need to bring our customs duties down to the levels prevailing in other East Asian countries. I don't know why this was reversed. I am not persuaded that it's a good thing. Because the truth of the matter is, if we want to join the global community, we cannot be too much out of line. Now, I'm a little reassured that at a fairly high level in the government, people have said that Atmanirbhar is not a reversal to old-fashioned protectionism. They've also said that, look, we actually want India to join the supply chain, global supply chains. And, if that were the case, then I don't see the logic of not joining RCEP. Because it was, the Prime Minister himself had given a slogan, kind of going beyond the earlier slogan of look east, it said act east. So many people thought that act east meant that we will join the RCEP, which was then being negotiated, and we were very actively involved in that negotiation. But at the last minute, last year in November, we stayed out. I don't know what the reason for that was. Some people say it was the pressure of Indian industry or some sections of Indian industry. I think that was a mistake. We cannot join global supply chains if we raise our customs duties much higher than other countries. The essential part of joining a global supply chain is that if you're planning global production and you want to move things from A to B, depending on which is most cost effective, you should be able to do that without cascading of import duties. Now, this is a position in which there's one aspect here which you need to keep in mind. Globally, there is a lot of suspicion and negative feeling about China. We won't go into why, it's obvious. And therefore, many people said that, those who run global supply chains would be looking for ways of diversifying away from China. India would be an ideal place for them to diversify into because it not only has the production capability skills, we have problems, but we can take care of those, but it also has a large market, an internal market. So if you move your global production chain towards India, you could not only benefit from the Indian market, you could also benefit from the global market using India as a base. I personally think that joining RCEP would have given a signal to the world that, look, you're scared of in China. We are part of Asia. It's the most progressively growing region of the world, which isn't resorting to protectionism. And we, India, are part of it. So if you want to access East Asia, do it from India. We have, in my view, we've cut off our own feet for no logical reason whatsoever. The usual argument given is that, no, China is part of RCEP and we can't compete against China. But we had a long lead time to prepare. The reduction in tariffs under RCEP was going to take place over a period of 20 years. So we have to ask ourselves that if 6 other nations in Southeast Asia are prepared to have a free trade arrangement with China, why can't India? And what is the signal that we are sending to these guys? It's certainly not a signal that, look, there are 2 countries. Now, India is not in the same, let's be very clear. India is not in the same league as China. We were in 1980, but over the years, we've fallen very far behind. It's not just the total GDP, it's also the level of technological sophistication. Because although, yes, we do have space capability and so on, but in commercial technical development, China is way ahead. Artificial intelligence, cyber security issues, digital research on digital issues, they're very far ahead. But nevertheless, other than China, we're the only moderately large country in the region. So if we were to join this group, people would say, well, the Indians are managing, they also want to look good vis-a-vis China. China will certainly slow down. And to some extent, the negative feeling about China globally will force them to slow down. This is when we should be in the place, looking as like the good guys. But we kind of opted out. I don't see the logic of that at all. So I don't know whether this is due to Atmanirbhar or whether it's just bad policy. But it's bad policy.
Yes, that's true, and India should take advantage of the rising protectionism. Sir, we'll now start with the audience questions. A question asked by one of our audience is that what policy should be taken up for the tourism sector, which has been hard hit by the pandemic?
There's not very much that you can do about tourism without bringing the health situation to normal. Frankly, I think people greatly underestimate the negative impact of the pandemic and all these pictures of corpses floating down the Ganga and so on that they have done internationally. It may be that the international press has slightly exaggerated it. I mean, the press always exaggerates things. But the fact is, if you look and you track the international press, the image created is that if anyone was thinking of traveling to India, they must have said, well, not now, maybe a year or 2 later. So, this year, you can't even travel from India to other parts of the world. So it's very difficult to believe that we will be able to have a revival of high-end tourism. Domestic tourism, yes, but the domestic tourism will revive as and when the lockdowns associated with the pandemic ease up. The most important thing for that is vaccination. So I'm personally of the view that the government I think the government has put a very good target. Uh, I think the target that's been stated is universal vaccination of the adult population by the end of December. Okay. Now that means vaccinating something like 800 million people, of that order. We have at the moment vaccinated maybe 230 or 240 million people with just one dose, of whom maybe 4 million or so have both doses. So we still have a lot of one doses to be given to the fellows who have just got one dose. And then in addition to that, we have to provide double dose vaccination for 600 million people. So you really need something of the order of 1,500 million doses of vaccine between now and the end of December. I don't know what arrangements have been made to tie this up, but I also think, by the way, that having adopted an ambitious target for which I would compliment the government, you shouldn't expect that it'll be 100% achieved. I mean, as in any exam, if they had this target and in the end they achieve, say, 85% of it, I would say that's pretty good. But let's be clear, it should be at least 85%. In other words, something of the order of 650 million or people should have been vaccinated. We can calculate what that involves, and I am not aware whether the government has placed orders for this entire period on the existing suppliers. There's no reason why they shouldn't. You don't have to do this month by month. I think you can invite a tender saying, look, I'm willing to buy 300 million doses of vaccines from whatever, Covishield and something else from Covaxin and the others, and then announce that these fellows have agreed to provide so much in this month, so right after December. And then track whether they're doing it, help them if they run into some difficulties. But people would know what the plan is. At the moment, we know that there is a target. We don't know how many vaccines have been ordered. So I would suggest that we get into a high octane, totally transparent vaccination drive, and never mind about the fiscal deficit. If it costs a few thousand crores extra, spend it. It's not a problem. But it's not just a question of spend it. Place the orders now. And the orders can always be placed that if you fail to deliver when you did, there'll be a penalty and we'll get the stuff from somewhere else. Similarly, they are discussing with global suppliers and they should in fact put in orders there. Right now, there isn't very much vaccine available globally, but by September, October, there'll be a lot more available. By then, we should have placed these orders. So I think that if you want tourism, etc., to recover, the solution doesn't lie in getting a little more credit for a hotel which doesn't have any customers. The solution lies in getting yourself activated so that people start behaving normally and normal transport and activity starts. That's the best way that we can handle the problem.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. And indeed, vaccination is something which is imperative in the current scenario. So moving on to the next question, it has been asked by Bharat Kandoi. The question is that many economists are saying to print more currency to overcome this economic crisis, but on the contrary, we see inflation which is very high compared to previous years. So by printing more money, won't there be any chances of inflation getting further higher? So
I think that's absolutely correct in the sense that when you push the fiscal deficit too high and you support that through a Reserve Bank support of government borrowing, which amounts to monetary expansion, the danger you run is that inflation will go up. It is going up, and it's going up around the world. So I think we are in a world in which that danger is there. But on the other hand, you also need to keep in mind that the economy is still tottering. So it's a balancing act. I don't think the fiscal deficit is meant to be a long-term solution. In my view on this is that, look, as long as what you're doing on the fiscal deficit is only adding to the demand which is necessary for the economy to get back to normal, what you're in the short run, you're not crowding out anybody. By stimulating the economy, you're generating both income and supply, so that should moderate inflation. Some of the inflation is imported, which you can't take care of by demand side measures anyway. And then your real problem is that this cannot be a permanent solution. You having increased the fiscal deficit, you will add to the debt. So next year you'll be going into a situation with a much higher debt to GDP ratio. The fear is that people will think that you are now on a one-way trip for fiscal irresponsibility. How do you handle that? You can only handle that by introducing measures which people see represent a real reform going forward. I mean, for example, if we were to get rid of 4 or 5 public sector enterprises and get over this bogey that the government can never get rid of public sector enterprises, that would be a very major signal. But as I said, the problem is you will be faced with situations where you may have to do that at a price less than what you actually proposed. So you must have the courage to realize that if the market is low, you can't expect to get a better price. That's one point. The second point is that you need to put in place very strong measures to improve the tax ratio. And you know, in my article in Mint, I've actually suggested that in 1991, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was looking at a similar situation, he appointed the Raja Chelya Committee. It was a committee of experts, distinguished experts with international experience, well-known tax accountants, fellows with experience in the private sector, and so on. I think we need a similar thorough look at the Indian tax structure, beginning with the GST, but going beyond the GST also to realize how is it that we can improve the administration of taxation. See, a lot of businessmen will tell you that our tax system is very unpredictable and people sort of suddenly impose very unreasonable assessments. Part of that problem is that we subject our tax officers to very unrealistic revenue targets. If the budget was formulated on the assumption of 11.3% growth, and that led to a certain assumption of growth of revenue, then each tax officer will have been told that I expect you to raise your revenue in your circle by this much. But you know, if that GDP growth is not going to be realized, then it is sensible to recognize right at the start that you're not going to get that revenue. And please don't push the tax officers to generate it, even though the reality doesn't allow it. Because if you don't change that, they will just be imposing unreasonable assessments, which businessmen will then call tax terrorism. And I think this is not a new problem. This has been there for a long time. And the fact is that there was a committee appointed under Mr. Parthasarathi Shrom, which looked at tax administration and all the things you have to do in order to make the Indian tax administration globally competitive. To my knowledge, no action has been taken on that. There's too much focus on tax rates because, you know, when the budget is presented, that's what all the TV commentators concentrate on. There's very little focus on creating a system which generates confidence, where taxpayers know that the system is transparent and they can assume that, look, it's easy to comply, and if you try to cheat, you will fail.
Pranav, sir, I have a quick follow-up to that question. Sir, according to my knowledge, tax evasion was seen as a major issue in the Raja Chelya committee. So how relevant is that problem today, and how do you think we can tackle it?
Well, it is a relevant problem because I think many studies which have been done internationally, and these studies are, I've not looked at them very carefully, but I've been told of the results. These studies clearly show that as a ratio to GDP, India should be getting maybe 3 percentage points of GDP more in tax revenue. And if you look at the last 20 years, and I'm not talking about the current government, this is also true in the previous government, we had an increase in tax rates, tax mobilization in the first 4 years or so of the UPA. After that, the tax ratio has kind of remained a bit fixed and it has not, in fact, increased. So there's something wrong there. And, it's not enough. I mean, we should first work out what is wrong and then try to correct it. I mean, you might say that the tax stagnation is a crisis and it's an opportunity to do something, but do what? Not anything. But I would say it's an opportunity to convince oneself what are the 5 or 6 critical things which account for the stagnation in tax to GDP ratio, and then let's fix them.
Yes, sir, that's true. And tax reforms have been the talk of town recently. Sir, in your opinion, what will be the impact of global corporate tax on India? This is a question by Avanendra.
Well, I think what's happening, remember the global corporate tax is only, global taxes were much lower than our taxes, and we've been lowering our taxes in line with that. The global tax reform is really directed at making sure that companies do not push themselves into low tax areas because there will be a minimum floor amongst the richer countries of, say, 21% corporate tax. And if somebody goes into a regime which has lower than that, they'll still have to pay the 21%. So that will favor us because the desire to put your profits into some other low tax jurisdiction will disappear. So that is in our favor, and we should welcome that because we are not the ones who have very, very low tax rates. We've been lowering our tax rates, but we haven't lowered them to this level.
Yes, thank you, sir, for the answer. Now, moving on to the next question by Mukund Mishra. So he's asking that, could you answer me if the acquisition of national income of our country by the top percentile is causing low rate of growth in India's GDP as we see increasing capital interest rate and decreasing GDP growth rate? So are we seeing a central contradiction in India?
Well, I think this is actually an important issue. All over the world, inequality is going up, and it's been going up for the last 10 years or so. I don't think we should confuse the crisis we are facing now with this underlying longer-term trend. What is happening now is that the crisis, recovery from the crisis is K-shaped, which means when I say K-shaped, it's not V-shaped. V-shaped implies that everybody gets hit and then everybody recovers. What's happening here is K-shaped. That is, some people continue to go down, informal sector, the small scale, etc. But some fellows are doing very well, even though the economy is doing badly. Now, this is quite different from the longer term question. I don't think that you are seeing a K-shaped recovery because rich people have become a lot richer. This is really because the economy has been slowing down. It's been slowing down because we have not identified what are the factors that would have maintained higher growth. Those factors are factors that would stimulate investment. Those factors are that would provide a better infrastructure to make India competitive, a much, much better financial system where reforms have not taken place. And I think if we did all that, we would not see the low growth that we are seeing. Plus, of course, if we didn't have a pandemic, we wouldn't have seen the low growth. So I think it's quite wrong to confuse the present very disturbing situation with the tendency for incomes to increase. Income inequality is increasing. And I think the way to take care of that is to have a more rational tax system, so that the very, very rich are taxed a little bit more, not in a extortionary kind of way, but they should be paying more than what they are paying. There's no doubt about that. But it's precisely these things, by the way, that lead to the need for a systemic reform or appointing a committee. Let me just give you one example. Possibly the most famous person who is associated with this, the new trend in inequality, is Thomas Piketty, the French author who wrote this book on capital. Now, Piketty says that the solution lies in introducing wealth taxes. Okay, I'm not sure about that. I mean, because income inequality should lead to progressive income taxation. I'm not sure that a tax on wealth, which is very difficult to measure every year, is actually a very good move. On the other hand, we are totally out of line with the rest of the world in not having any kind of inheritance tax. So, if somebody, nothing wrong with somebody accumulating a lot of wealth, but when they pass on that wealth without sharing any of it, that leads to not a very good outcome. I'm not even saying, by the way, that elsewhere in the world, what they do is they have inheritance taxes, but with lots of exemptions for people who want to contribute their wealth to charity. So over time, particularly in the United States, this is what has happened. Very rich people have set up charities. Now, of course, it's true that they appoint their children on these charities. But if you've given 100 million to a charity and your kid is running it and getting 1 million a year out of it, that's not a bad deal, providing the charity is doing really good work. So I think that how you react to this requires some careful thought. And I think that, wealth taxes, in my view, are very inefficient. But more progressive income taxation is certainly relevant and should be done. And for example, there's no reason why dividend taxation should be at a kind of a fixed sort of rate. I mean, it should be integrated with the rest of the income. And the original decision why dividend taxes had lots and lots of relief was really the belief that it was very difficult to administer. So you wanted to have a kind of arbitrary percentage imposed on dividends. But today, with Aadhaar and all the rest of it, I mean, no dividend can be paid to anybody who doesn't have Aadhaar. And you can check whether the fellows who are getting a reasonable amount of dividend income have filed their income tax return. So big data allows you to process many of these things. And I think we need to have a comprehensive relook at our tax system. But it needs to be done with lots of consultation. It cannot be left simply to the Department of Revenue in the Ministry of Finance. It should be done by having an expert group submit a report that can be discussed. And, I also feel that our traditions of budgetary secrecy are a bit foolish. I mean, they are very old-fashioned. And there's nothing wrong, in my view, with the budget being presented, which is put out in the public on the tax side 6 months in advance. And look, this is what we're going to do. Let's have a discussion. Let all the industry fellows represent and so on. Today, what happens is that when the finance minister goes into parliament holding her brief or bag, there's a huge excitement. What is she going to announce? Elsewhere in the world, that's not the way budgets are made. And I think we are just caught in a time warp, which I think we need to get out of.
Thank you, sir, for the detailed answer. So the final question for today is by Labib Hassan. And the question is, given the current macroeconomic scenario, if you're asked to prepare another M document, what policy responses will be included in that?
Well, look, most of all, I'm hoping that some of the economists in government are preparing these documents. People who've done this 30 years ago are not the best people to do it again. But if you're asking me, what do I think are the most important things that we should focus on, maybe in the next 3 or 4 years or so, I would certainly say that the following are the most important. Number one, don't be too worried about the fiscal deficit for the current year, but for God's sake, have a credible strategy for the next 4 or 5 years, bringing it down. People will not lose confidence in India just because the deficit goes up this year. I mean, Biden has taken the US deficit to double-digit numbers, so they can hardly applaud him and say that India is going down the tube. So I think whatever we do this year, the important question is, what are we going to do next year? And in my view, if she appoints a committee to make a thorough reform of our tax system and gets that committee to report by the end of December, so that the entire discussion on taxation for the next year is conditioned by a publicly available report, it would increase confidence. So that's my first proposal. Second, I think that the raising of customs duties and the refusal to join RCEP was a mistake. Even if we don't immediately lower customs duties, we need to give a clear signal that Atmanirbhar does not mean that in order to produce things domestically, we're going to keep raising duties. You have seen that problem, for example, in solar. I mean, we are applauded in the rest of the world for having taken an initiative on solar, which I think the government deserves credit for. Big targets have been set, etc. But at the same time, in order to indigenize the production of panels, we have levied huge duties on solar cells and modules. This has created a lot of uncertainty on the part of private investors who don't want to bid for setting up new solar plants for two reasons. One is they don't really know whether you're suddenly going to sort of slap duties on their import. And secondly, most of our discoms are broke. And they have been reneging on power purchase agreements on the grounds that since prices are falling, they don't want to pay earlier commitments. Now, the current assumption is that today's solar price will fall by 30-35% or so over the next 5 or 6 years. Now, if we have a reputation that our discoms will cancel whatever power purchase agreement that has been entered into now, because technological change makes power cheaper, solar power cheaper, a couple of years from now, it seriously discourages investment. So I think we need to, on the duty front, we need a very clear signal. And I think that we should have a signal which says that, look, we will moderate our customs duties and bring them in line with what exists in the RCEP countries. And I would go further and say we should join RCEP. I mean, we have that option. The door is open. We should walk in. That would make a huge difference. Now, industry will object initially because they'll say, you haven't given us all the support we need. You have a lousy infrastructure. You're doing nothing about it. Then we should work on giving them good infrastructure support, not give them protection. I mean, and that's really depends on political persuasion, political leadership, etc. And I think that we should do. Third, the present approach to banking sector reform doesn't work. And this is something I would blame not just the present government, but actually all of us, even in the past. We identified the need for financial sector and banking sector reform a long time ago. But we were not willing to put public sector banks on the same basis as private sector banks. They remain privileged. They don't have the same regulatory pressure. They don't have the same pressure to improve efficiency. And this is not workable. Now, I mean, it was Yashwant Sinha who said under Vajpayee a long time ago that he's going to reduce the government share of public sector banks down to 33%. That was the right thing to do. But he wasn't able to do it because, I mean, we know that the Congress party was not in favor of giving up government control of public sector banks, but even the BJP didn't seem to want to do it. Now, banking reform, well, merger is no reform. I mean, merger is a little convenience. If you merge a good bank with a bad bank, you get an average type of bank. And sometimes what happens is that the average performance is worse than the others taken together. But what you do need to do is to get the governance of public sector banks really improved. And if you don't want to give up government ownership, the PJ Nayak committee way back in 2015 had proposed that, look, why don't you set up a holding company, put all the government shares in the banks into the holding company, let the holding company be run not by babus, but by finance professionals with a lot of international experience and domestic experience. The key thing is that the top appointments in the banks should be made by the board of the holding company, not by the cabinet. So it's not a political appointment. Cabinet appoints the guys who go to the holding company. So it's not as if you're handing it over. But having given it to them, what you're really saying is, now you appoint the top manager. And the finance ministry should be taken completely out of the picture. Now, this is the only way that bank managements will look to a new holding company management to get their signals. Today, if you happen to be a top manager in a public sector bank, you better kowtow to the joint secretary in the Ministry of Finance. Now, let me say, I failed to get this done myself because this sort of hadn't been, the PJ Nayak committee had not come in. But we were aware that, government control over the public sector banks is not conducive to public sector banks behaving in a efficient manner, the way a good banking system should behave. And I think we have not done anything in that area, and quite honestly, we need to. Now, one good thing that has happened over many years is that there is a private sector, and that's growing. And most probably its share, originally its share was only 25%, has now gone to about a little less than 40%. Many people say in another 5 years it might go to 50%. But the funny thing is we are willing to privatize the banking sector, but we're not willing to privatize the public sector banks. That just means they'll keep on performing in this not very efficient manner. And that's not because they don't have good management. They have excellent potential, but they're effectively under the control of a civil service. And, that is not the way to run a bank. So that would be in the latest version of the M document, that would be very high. To be honest with you, if you were to tell me this is not going to happen, then I'm not at all confident that you can go back to 7% growth. Because even today what is happening is that the government is unwilling within the public sector to let the weaker banks fade out. The theory of recapitalizing a bank is that you should recapitalize the more efficient public sector banks and hold back the weaker ones. But there's extreme reluctance to do that. And you can understand why, because whoever's in charge of the weaker bank always finds some other reason why the bank is weak. And if the government has people on the board, it really can't blame the managing director for performance because they're there. Even the RBI has somebody on a bank board, which is wrong in my opinion. And I think that, it's not generally realized, but the RBI does not have the same power over a public sector bank that it has over a private sector bank. In the case of a private sector bank, it can remove the management if it feels it is not doing a good job. In the case of the public sector bank, it can't. It can write letters and tell the finance ministry that it isn't doing a good job, but it cannot say that this person must be removed. And if it had that power, then that person would look to the RBI with a lot more respect than they do now. That's a lot of things to do. Yeah, one other thing. I've been talking about things that the central government has to do, but I honestly believe that the most important privatization that we should attempt is the privatization of the distribution companies in the states. Frankly, if you are running a state, having a first-class electricity distribution system which will support a push towards greater industrialization should have a very, very high priority. And it's not going to happen if it remains in the government control the way it is today. Some state governments, I mean, the Delhi government a very long time ago got rid of the public sector run Delhi distribution company and put in two companies, Tata's and BSES, which is an Ambani company, a Reliance company. And there's no doubt that the distribution system in Delhi, electricity distribution system, has improved enormously. I don't see why we can't say that, look, in the next 5 years, the electricity system, and Mumbai is in any case private, Calcutta is private, Ahmedabad, I think, is private. Why can't we say that Bengaluru, Chennai, Nagpur, Jalandhar, Lucknow, and 2 or 3 others, the city system will be privatized? I mean, I'm not saying privatize the whole system, but at least see what private enterprise can do to increase efficiency. And that would be a test. There's no question that in Delhi, the privatization has led to huge improvements in efficiency. And even NGOs that were very critical of privatization, what they now say is that the privatization was done in the wrong way, but they agree that the performance of the system is much better. So I hope that when you write your, whichever alphabet you choose for the document, depending on your names, you will remember some of these ideas and push them. Because actually it's going to depend on you. I mean, the benefits of all of this will only become evident in 5 years' time. And remember the 1991 reform, that was a long time ago. I mean, to just make a point, that was before email. You know, for you guys have gone beyond email. You're on SMS and WhatsApp and Instagram and so forth. 91, we didn't even have emails. And it took at least 10 years for India's economic performance to improve. So what is done today will revive growth over a 4-5 year period. You will all be working by then. So you will be the first functional beneficiaries of that reform. So it is in your interest that you get the political system to respond to your demands for doing reforms. But please remember, the slogan of reforms is not of interest because everybody has that slogan. The question is, what are you going to do in these very specific areas? And if you're not prepared to do these specific things, then you have to make a judgment. I mean, you know, is it going to work or is it not going to work?
Thank you, sir. So that brings us to the end of the session. Now, over to Tanishq again.
Thank you so much, sir. That was indeed a very good conversation. We learned so many things today. And in fact, I think that the last question was a very good question which helped us to understand the issue in more detail and, you know, also know more about what you think should be done and should are the problems in the economy today. As a student of political science, sir, I have a takeaway that sometimes the developmental economics is trumped by political calculations and complexities. So that is sad. Like when you mentioned about the RCEP, I think today RCEP for the Indian government is a no-go because of China. So we are in a sad state of affairs when such political complexities or compulsions block developmental economics. That brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much, sir, once again. Before we conclude, we will have a formal vote of thanks by Dr. Ravi Nandan. Sir, please go ahead.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia. This was fantastic. And, the pandemic, as it has now been begun to be called as the syndemic, seems to, of course, affecting everyone and everything. And, economy being affected, of course, we are all going to be affected doubly. It's just such a grace and gift that we get to hear people like you, and your immense kindness, in the beginning when you said that it's such a delight to come and talk to young people, and this spirit has sustained this series, the series called Compass, which has been run by the students of Caucus. So I really salute that spirit, and this gift that you provided to these students. I was thinking when you mentioned about that brief, sort of nostalgic thing of being at Stevens and seeing Hindu across in your student days. I was thinking of a similar anecdote way back when I was a student at Khalsa College, and at the graduation ceremony, you were the chief guest, and I have a fond memory of receiving a gift from you, a prize, in fact, at that moment. So yeah, it's such a wonderful thing to keep, in this kind of exchange where people can come and tell us, which cuts out so many things that we hear on daily basis, and provides this fresh, blazing fresh, perspective to look at things. So I thank you, sir, once again for this brilliant, and very kind, engagement with us. And I also want to thank you on behalf of the college, Professor Anju Srivastav, the principal, who, as you can imagine, is working partly from home, partly from office with mixed staff. So has not been able to come today, but has expressed sincere thankfulness to you. Same with IQAC, our cell in the college, headed by Dr. Shalini Suryanarayan. She also has expressed her thankfulness for you for this talk. So I end this vote of thanks by repeating once again, it has been an immense pleasure, even for a sociologist who otherwise wouldn't follow much of economics. I can say very, gladly that I followed all of what you said. And, thank you, sir, once again.
Thank you so much, Ravinandan, sir. Once again, before we all leave this webinar, sir, it was indeed a pleasure for us to have you today. And it also comes as a special symbol, since sir wrote this article for the Hindustan Times, marking 30 years of the 1991. So what better time than today to have an engaging discussion with sir? Once again, a recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube as well as our website, that is www.caucushindu.in. I thank all our viewers as well as panelists for joining us today. Sir, thank you so much for joining us once again, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, sir.